Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news. The Bloomberg Businessweek podcast with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec from Bloomberg Radio.
Well, the market and the softer than expected payrolls report certainly a top story today. So this other one got a little lost in the shuffle. JP Morgan Chase CEO.
I'm still glad you're talking about this one.
This was, you wake up this morning before, and I mean, this is when I woke up, and this was like a headline this morning.
Go through it,
JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon said the next U.S. president must work to bring together a, quote, deeply divided nation as domestic and geopolitical issues mount, and said the business world should have representation in the cabinet. Here's what he wrote. The private sector has huge wells of expertise and produces 85% of our nation's jobs. This was in an opinion piece published early this morning in the Washington Post. It should have a seat at the table. Yet in recent years, government leaders have often failed to engage those in industry. A president should put the most talented people, including those from business and the opposite party, into their cabinet.
So a quote, seat at the table. Jamie Dimon is talking about is representation, having those who are in the private sector helping to shape policy, giving those in business a say in government. At its core, this is really governance.
It's an important concept, not just in politics, but also in business, and that's corporate governance. Bryce Tingle is an expert in it. He's a business law professor at the University of Calgary, and he's got a new book out. It's called Hard Lessons in Corporate Governments. Professor, good to have you with us this afternoon. How are you?
Good, thanks. Thank you very much, Carol. Tim, I'm delighted to be here.
So I just want to start with the failure of corporate governance here in the U.S. Where do you see examples of it failing?
It fails in two different ways. One is for the last 30 years, we've really changed the way companies are governed. And as I detail at length in the book, we've studied the outcomes, and the changes we made either don't make any difference to the way corporations work, or they make things a little worse. And you can see that, we really started experimenting with corporate governance in the early 90s. And you can see that in things like the dot-com collapse and some of the bad behavior that led to the 2008 financial crisis and stock option backdating and executive pay. So even if you're not really familiar with the empirical literature, at this point, it's becoming pretty obvious that what we were doing isn't working. But the second way that governance fails is we've made it really unpleasant to be a company that's subject to our corporate governance rules. And those rules live in the public markets. And so we have seen over the last 20 some odd years a growing reluctance on the part of American businesses to join the public markets.
So, going into, it's funny, I was thinking about, we talk about public markets versus private, and I do wonder about how that plays into it because, when you've got folks like us who are covering companies on a quarterly basis, there are certain metrics that we measure them by, right? And certainly investors do. And I do wonder how that kind of gets in the way of maybe doing better when it comes to corporate governance. So have public markets failed us?
I think public markets are failing us. I don't think I'd use the past tense. They're failing us because we all depend on new innovative businesses coming to the public markets and making themselves available for the average investor to invest in and exposing their business in the way that your show permits. You get a lot more transparency in the public markets. And so if the public markets aren't doing the job of attracting new businesses into them, they're beginning to fail. They're about half the size they were 20 some odd years ago.
Let's talk compensation and executive compensation here, because let's be honest. I think many people would argue it's gotten a little out of hand in terms of pay packages.
You have a chapter devoted to this.
For executives of U.S. companies. What is the relationship between governance and executive compensation?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In some ways, compensation is what got us started in making all the changes we have over the last 30 years. The notion behind modern governance is that we're trying to control the behavior of managers. They're in the situation where they have custody of the shareholders' property, that is, the assets of the business, and we want to prevent them from misusing them or dealing with them in a self-interested way. And the most obvious way for them to do that is obviously with executive compensation, paying themselves too much. And so right from the early days of the modern corporate governance regime in the early 90s, we saw sustained efforts on the parts of multiple parties, including U.S. Congress, to control executive pay. And I think at this point, we can all say that everything we've done is a failure.
The salaries might have been reduced or have stayed stable, but total compensation has gone through the roof.
Yeah, it now takes more than twice as much of the profits of a company to pay its most senior executives than it did back in 1992. So yeah, it has been a failure. The thing I point out in my book is that the very things that we tried as part of our corporate governance reforms actually were the things that led to this huge increase in executive pay. The truth is executive pay had stayed pretty flat from the end of the Second World War into the late 1970s, and then it rose only very slightly in the 1980s. The time when we start experimenting with corporate governance in the early 90s is when executive pay just explodes.
You know, we were thinking about a couple of companies, to be quite honest with you, when Tim and I were prepping for this, Bryce, and like Tesla, good corporate governance. Boeing, good corporate governance.
Why are you laughing? He's laughing when you ask Tesla.
Good corporate governance, which we've all been talking about, kind of a real life succession drama playing out.
Yeah, well, let's take Tesla, because Elon Musk is always the most entertaining. So you can have a couple views about that Tesla pay package. I mean, of course, it seems like it's absurdly too big, but the $58 billion, maybe $52 billion, if you parse the numbers carefully. The Delaware court threw it out. And what's interesting is the total irrelevance of the reason the Delaware court threw it out. So the Delaware court threw it out because it said Elon Musk has got too much power, and the independent directors on the board of Tesla weren't really independent. And they didn't disclose to the shareholders at the time the shareholders voted back in 2018 that they weren't as independent as maybe the shareholders assumed. That, in a nutshell, is what the court held. And that strikes lots of people, including the shareholders who voted again to award Elon his pay package just a month ago. Strikes a lot of observers as dumb and kind of irrelevant. It was clear in 2018 that Elon Musk was the driving force behind Tesla. And the size of his pay package, the terms on which it was made available to him, was well reported by the financial press. It was fairly and accurately disclosed in the materials that were sent to the shareholders. It would have been no trouble for the shareholders to evaluate its impact in terms of dilution, and they voted in favor of it. It's safe to say that no shareholder cast their vote under a mistaken belief about the independence of Elon's board, yet that turned out to be crucial for the Delaware decision. And it's a sign of the way in which our beliefs about corporate governance have begun increasingly to diverge from reality.
We only have 20 seconds left, but what about Fox Corp, News Corp? Because there's this great New York Times story last week about the secret battle for the future of the Murdoch empire. Very briefly.
Well, that's a great question. I'm not sure I can do it just in 20 seconds. But it is a sign that often the most important parts of corporate governance aren't about who's the independent director or whether or not the shareholders have majority voting. It's about the character and personalities leading the company.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us. That's Professor Bryce Tingle. His new book is called Hard Lessons in Corporate Governance. He's business law professor at the University of Calgary, joining us from Calgary.
It's a really timely topic. We kind of talk about it a lot, corporate governance.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.